MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo received the final intelligence assessments for late October 1950, with a confidence that the operational files of Far East Command would later make embarrassing to read. The North Korean People's Army had shattered under the Incheon landing 6 weeks earlier and was scattered across the mountains of the peninsula in fragments too disorganized to reconstitute. American, South Korean, and Commonwealth units were driving north through a country that had largely stopped offering resistance. The Yalu River, the border with China, was within reach of the forward elements, and the question occupying MacArthur's staff was mostly administrative: how long the paperwork would take before the boys went home. MacArthur had told his commanders it would be Christmas. A significant portion of his staff believed him, and their intelligence assessments reflected that belief in the way assessments tend to when the conclusion is already decided. The Third Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 3 RAR, had arrived at Busan on the 27th of September, 1950. The battalion's commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Green, who had taken command of a unit that had no collective combat record in this war. They moved north quickly with the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade. 3 weeks off the transport ship, and the battalion was part of the advance pushing toward the Chinese border. First contact came on the 22nd of October at Yeongju, where 3 RAR engaged North Korean forces, one of the fastest operational debuts the battalion had recorded in any campaign. 3 days later, the operational picture changed at a scale nobody at Far East Command had anticipated. China entered the Korean War on the 25th of October, 1950, and it didn't announce itself in advance. The People's Liberation Army had been massing on the northern bank of the Yalu for weeks, moving at night and sheltering during the day to avoid aerial observation. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers crossed using terrain that MacArthur's analysts had dismissed as impassable. Far East Command had seen the indicators, aerial photographs and agent reports indicating a large buildup, and the conclusion drawn from that evidence was that intervention on a large scale was unlikely. That conclusion was wrong by approximately 300,000 soldiers who were already on the Korean side of the river when the assessments were filed. The first assault in late October hit the South Korean II Corps on the right flank of the 8th Army's advance. The South Koreans broke and fell back. American units got their first contact with Chinese infantry and pulled back. The fighting lasted roughly a week and then stopped. Chinese divisions that had made contact disappeared back into the hills as cleanly as they'd come out of them, and the battlefield went quiet. MacArthur's staff concluded it was a probe, China testing UN resolve before deciding whether to escalate, and MacArthur ordered the advance to resume on the 24th of November. What came next made clear that the probe assessment was wrong. On the 25th of November, 18 Chinese divisions hit the 8th Army's line along the Changchun River in coordinated attacks across hundreds of kilometers of front. The South Korean II Corps on the right flank collapsed within hours. When a flank collapses at that speed, the formations adjacent to it lose their own defensive integrity before they've had time to reorient. The problem spread left through the American line as unit after unit found itself exposed on its open side. By nightfall on the 25th, the 8th Army's advance, intact and moving 48 hours earlier, was broken across multiple sectors, and the retreat that followed in the days after was different in character from anything the 8th Army had executed before. The American soldiers named it themselves. Bugout was GI slang for an unauthorized withdrawal, a retreat taken without orders, driven by the individual soldier's calculation that the position was gone, and south was the only direction that made sense. The term spread through the 8th Army's communications in the first days of December because it was accurate. Vehicles were abandoned on roads with fuel still in the tanks. Crew-served weapons were left in ditches. Supply depots that should have been evacuated or destroyed were abandoned with enough ammunition and rations inside them to sustain a Chinese regiment through the winter. Officers lost contact with their companies. The road south of the Changchun filled with men and machines moving in one direction at varying speeds, and the word formation ceased to apply to most of what was on it. Reporters who drove that road in early December 1950 described passing artillery pieces left on the verge, their bridges intact, their crews gone. They described ammunition dumps burning uncontrolled because nobody had stayed long enough to do the job properly. The physical evidence of what had happened to the 8th Army was spread across hundreds of kilometers of Korean road. Homer Bigart of the New York Herald Tribune was filing from that road in those weeks. His dispatches described the 8th Army's retreat as disorderly and shameful. His words in print in the Tribune. He wrote about columns that had lost their officers, about men dropping weapons to move faster, and what he described amounted to a military institution in the process of coming apart. Bigart wasn't the only correspondent on the road. A dozen American journalists were filing from the same area in the same period, and the dispatches that came out of Korea in December 1950 were the harshest copy about American military performance that the entire war produced. And the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade was about to be handed the rearguard assignment for all of it. The brigade, 3 RAR, alongside the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, the Middlesex Regiment, and supporting elements, was assigned to cover the withdrawal. Someone had to hold the road open while the 8th Army moved south, and the Commonwealth units got the task. The assignment meant occupying a position, holding it until the formations behind had cleared, withdrawing in order to the next position south, and repeating this sequence for as long as the retreat required. It meant maintaining direct contact with an advancing Chinese army. At the same time, the battalion was managing the movement of retreating Americans behind them. Green's battalion had 800 men. The Chinese had committed 18 divisions to the push south, and they were moving. Green had fought in the previous war, and he understood what a rearguard required at its most demanding. The mechanism of a covered withdrawal is straightforward to describe and difficult to execute under real pressure. One element holds and suppresses while another moves to the next position behind it, then the rear element stops and covers while the forward element withdraws through it. Every man in the position is accounted for before the withdrawal is complete. Every weapon comes out. The position being vacated needs to look disciplined to any Chinese observer on the high ground, because a disorganized break invites pursuit, and pursuit against a rearguard that's lost its structure is catastrophic. 3 RAR executed this mechanism correctly at multiple positions over weeks of continuous operations. The first major test of it came at Pakchon. In late November, 3 RAR occupied a defensive position covering a river crossing in the Chongchon Valley that American units still north of the river needed to use to get south. Green's companies established the perimeter on the near bank, occupying ground that gave them fields of fire to the north and observation of the approaches on both flanks. Chinese forces were north of the battalion and closing. The contact wasn't continuous. The Chinese probed, pulled back, probed again, working to find the edges of the position and determine its strength before committing to a direct assault. Green's companies held through the probing and held through the direct pressure that followed it. American soldiers came through the Australian position in conditions ranging from formed company groupings with officers to individuals moving alone, all of them going south, none of them stopping. Some of the American units that passed through still had their weapons, some didn't. The Australians let them through and held the crossing. When the last organized American elements had cleared the river and the Chinese pressure made holding untenable, Green's companies withdrew in sequence. One company covered while the next broke contact and moved south to the next bound. The covering company followed when the moving company had established its position. The crossing was held for the time it needed to be held, and then 3 RAR moved to the next position down the road. British officers at brigade headquarters wrote their after-action reports through this period, and those reports recorded what they observed about 3 RAR. Positions ordered to hold were held. Withdrawals were conducted to the parameters of the order, equipment accounted for, casualty recovery maintained. The battalion's command structure, from Green through his company commanders down to platoon and section level, remained intact and functional through an operation that lasted weeks and placed the battalion in simultaneous contact with Chinese forces to the north and retreating American traffic to the south. Those reports went into the brigade's files and then into the official histories, and the picture they drew of 3 RAR's conduct during the bugout was consistent across every action the battalion fought. The contrast visible on the road itself was sharp enough that it didn't require a report to document. An officer at brigade headquarters who drove south along the Chongchon Valley Road in late November or early December would have passed through sections of road where American units were moving in loose, dispersed columns, weapons sometimes absent, vehicles sometimes overloaded with men who had abandoned their own transport, and then through a 3 RAR position where the men were in the ground watching the hills with their weapons, doing what they'd been told to do. It was the same road, the same Chinese threat to the north, and an entirely different army on each stretch of it. What those reports didn't fully capture was what it actually required to maintain that standard in the Chongchon Valley in November and December 1950. Korean winter in that terrain runs to temperatures well below zero at night, and the cold carries through the day at elevation. Frostbite was a regular casualty category for units in contact. Men operating in prolonged cold without adequate rest lose fine motor control first, then situational awareness, then the capacity to make sound decisions under pressure. 3 RAR operated without sustained rotation, no period of pulling back to warm the men, restore equipment, and restore sleep. They were in position and in contact in winter with Chinese forces to the north and an uncertain situation to the south, and the discipline required to hold a perimeter correctly, break contact cleanly, and account for every man at the end of a night action in those conditions is the discipline that either exists in a battalion or it doesn't. Green's battalion had it. The scale of what the battalion was operating inside through this period is worth setting in precise terms. 300,000 Chinese soldiers had crossed the Yalu since October. The 8th Army's forward line had been within approximately 80 kilometers of the Chinese border at its furthest point in mid-November. From there, the retreat to the 38th parallel covered hundreds of kilometers over the following weeks. The army that had been within reach of ending the war was, by mid-December, fighting to hold the border that the war had started from when the North Koreans crossed it on the 25th of June, 1950. Everything gained in the second half of the year was gone. In terms of ground surrendered in a single campaign, the bugout was the largest American military reversal since the Civil War, and 3 RAR was at the back of it the entire time, holding the next position on the list while the numbers kept getting worse. The Chinese army had logistics problems of its own that shaped how the pressure on the rearguard came and went. The PLA had moved fast and committed hard, but 300,000 soldiers over long supply lines in Korean winter, operating with limited mechanization and a logistics system built primarily on human carriers, couldn't sustain maximum pressure continuously. Chinese formations that had broken through the 8th Army's line in late November were slowing through December as their own supply situation deteriorated. The pressure on 3 RAR was real and constant in direction, but uneven in intensity. There were gaps between contacts, hours when the battalion could move without direct engagement, and the Australians used those periods to reposition and resupply rather than to stop. The discipline that held them in position when the Chinese were pushing held the battalion together in the gaps between contacts. The 8th Army's commanding general through the bugout was Lieutenant General Walton Walker. Walker had commanded the 8th Army since the start of the war and had managed the defense of the Pusan perimeter in August and September 1950, the operation that saved the entire UN position in Korea at its most precarious point. The bugout happened on his watch, and December 1950 was the operational context in which his name would be recorded in the campaign histories. On the 23rd of December 1950, Walker's vehicle was involved in a road accident north of Seoul. He passed away from the injuries. General Matthew Ridgway flew in from Washington within days to take command, and what he found when he toured the army he'd inherited was not what a general expects to find. Ridgway's own accounts of those first days record an organization that had stopped believing it could function offensively. The line was approximately stable. The bugout had ended when Chinese logistics ran short and the front consolidated along the 38th parallel, but the damage from weeks of disorganized retreat had gone deeper than the ground surrendered. Units had lost officers to the retreat in ways that went beyond casualties. Some had lost contact with their men in the chaos and never recovered it. Others had made command decisions during the bugout that they couldn't defend afterward, and a number had simply been separated from their units and never re-established control. The institutional knowledge that a formed military carries, which commanders make sound decisions under contact, which NCOs hold their section together when it gets bad, had been disrupted in ways that weeks of disorganization produce and months of disciplined work repairs. Ridgway spent the first half of 1951 rebuilding the 8th Army's capacity to attack. The Australians had spent December in the Chongchon Valley demonstrating what that capacity looked like when it was intact. 3 RAR didn't need rebuilding. The battalion came out of the bugout with its structure intact. Green had held the battalion accountable to positions and timelines, to the recovery of every man and every weapon through 6 weeks of continuous rearguard work. The battalion had been in country for less than 3 months with 800 men. The assignment had been the rearguard of the longest American military retreat since the Civil War, and 3 RAR had executed it without losing their collective cohesion. The British and Australian official histories of the Korean War recorded this in the factual language those documents use. Positions held, withdrawals conducted in order, and the record stayed on the shelf. The journalists mostly passed over it. Bigart and the other correspondents were writing about a catastrophe, and 3 RAR was a small formation doing its job correctly in the margin of that catastrophe. A Commonwealth battalion covering a crossing in good order while American soldiers came through their position didn't generate the kind of dispatch you filed when the story was an army coming apart on the road. The correspondents followed the collapse because the collapse was the story. David Halberstam, writing about the Korean War decades later, devoted substantial attention to the bugout as one of the most damaging events in the 8th Army's institutional history. The Commonwealth Brigade's rearguard work appears in that account the way it appeared in Bigart's dispatches, as context for the catastrophe, not as the subject of it. What got reported from Korea in December 1950 was the bugout, and the bugout is what the histories remember. 3 RAR continued in Korea through 1951. April brought Kapyong, where the battalion and the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry held a position against Chinese forces that had already broken through South Korean units on their flank. Kapyong earned 3 RAR, a United States Presidential Unit citation, awarded by President Truman and applied to the battalion's colors, one of the very few ever given to a formation that wasn't American. The battalion that held Kapyong in April 1951 was the battalion that had held Pakchon in November 1950, executing the same 2 principles Greene had run through the entire campaign: hold the position until told to move and account for every man when the order came. Greene handed over command in 1951. The soldiers who'd come through the rearguard rotated home or stayed for the next tour. What they'd done in the Chongchon Valley in November and December went into the files at the Australian War Memorial and the relevant British Army records, accurate and dry, and largely unread by the people who subsequently formed their opinions about Korea from the American accounts of the bugout. The official record said 3 RAR held the positions it was assigned, withdrew an order from each of them, and came out with its unit cohesion intact. The road south of Pakchon had confirmed it while it was happening. An American soldier from the 8th Army who passed through a 3 RAR position in December 1950 would have seen diggers in their positions, weapons ready, watching the hills to the north, letting the traffic through without comment. He might have heard one of them say something about the rations or the cold. He wouldn't have heard anything that sounded like a prepared statement about what the battalion was doing out there on the road to the south of a very large Chinese army. 3 RAR was working. That was what it looked like from the road.